People were already seated when he cleared his throat and thanked everyone for supporting the real family. Glasses paused midair. Someone laughed too quickly. My name sat on the place card in front of me, but it never reached his mouth. I kept holding the tray I was meant to present, standing just inside the circle of light, waiting for the correction that did not come. My mother watched him, not me. My brother smiled at the floor. No one said anything, in that room with every eye carefully elsewhere. I learned how easy it is to disappear in public. He didn't look at me when he sat down. He didn't need to. The omission had already settled into the room like something agreed upon. I moved the tray onto the table and stepped back, careful not to interrupt the rhythm that had formed without me. My father lifted his glass again, this time softer, adding a few polite words about effort and timing, about how things come together when people make the right choices. It sounded like praise, but it landed like a quiet sorting. Some people were included in that sentence. I wasn't. I had planned that evening for weeks. The menu was mine. The guest list had come through me. Even if his name was the one on the invitations, I coordinated the vendors. Confirmed the seating, handled the last-minute changes that always happen when appearances matter more than comfort. I did it because that's what I had always done. When something needed to hold, I held it. When the introductions began, he named people. In order of importance, investors first, then family, then the people who made things run. I waited for my place in that sequence, not because I needed recognition, but because it was the normal shape of things. Even in rooms like this, there is a pattern. People follow. He skipped over that pattern like it didn't apply. My mother clapped lightly at the right moments. My brother leaned back in his chair, relaxed, like he belonged exactly where he was. When my father mentioned him, there was warmth in his voice. A different kind of tone, earned maybe, or chosen. It's hard to tell the difference when you've been on the outside long enough. I stayed where I was until the tray felt too heavy to justify holding it any longer. Then I set it down fully, and took a seat at the far end of the table, the place that had been left open without being assigned. No one objected. No one made space. Conversations resumed around me, careful and controlled, like nothing had shifted. The authority in that room wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It showed itself in what was allowed to pass without question. My father didn't correct himself because no one required him to. My mother didn't speak because she understood the cost of interrupting him. My brother didn't step in because silence had always worked in his favor. And the guests, people who had watched me move through that evening, who had taken direction from me hours earlier, chose not to notice. At one point, one of the investors asked, "Who had organized the event?" My father answered before I could. He said it had been handled internally with help where needed. The man nodded, satisfied, and moved on. It was a small moment, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but it clarified something I had felt for years without naming: help where needed. That was what I was. Not a role, not a position, a function. Useful when things required steadiness, invisible when recognition was distributed. It wasn't said with cruelty. That's what made it harder to challenge. It was simply the version of me that worked best for everyone else. Dinner continued. Plates were cleared, courses, replaced conversations, shifted from business to polite stories that revealed nothing real. I answered when spoken to. I smiled when it was appropriate. I did not correct anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the structure I was sitting inside. Correction would not change it. It would only make the edges more obvious. When dessert was served, my father stood again. This time he spoke about the future, about expansion, about new partnerships, about how the next phase would require trust and alignment. He mentioned my brother again, placing him at the center of that future, like it had always been obvious. There was a brief pause, a space where another name could have been added. It stayed empty. I watched the room respond the way rooms like this always do. Heads nodded. Glasses lifted, agreements formed without being spoken. Decisions. In these spaces, don't always announce themselves. They settle quietly, then become facts. By the time the evening ended, nothing dramatic had happened. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a series of small choices that aligned in one direction. When people left, they thanked my father. A few of them nodded at me on their way out. Polite, distant, like acknowledging staff after an event runs smoothly, I stayed behind to make sure everything closed properly. Bills finalized, leftovers, packed, the last vendor paid. It was routine, familiar. By the time the house was quiet again, the only evidence of the evening was the faint smell of food and the empty glasses lined up on the counter. My father passed through the kitchen once before going upstairs. He paused just long enough to say, "It went well." I nodded. That was true. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. It took me longer than I like to admit to understand that nothing about that night was new. It only felt new because it finally happened in a way I could not ignore. Before that, everything had been small enough to excuse, quiet enough to carry. Growing up, I was the one who adjusted. First, if something broke, I fixed it. If someone argued, I softened it. If something went missing, I learned not to ask too many questions. It was never said out loud, but it was understood. I was reliable. He was not. And somehow that meant I would always absorb the difference. Even when we became adults, that pattern stayed in place. It just looked more reasonable, more disguised. When he lost jobs, I called it bad luck. When he borrowed money, I called it temporary. When he avoided responsibility, I called it stress. Every explanation sounded kinder than the truth. So I chose them. There were moments that should have stopped me. The first time he didn't pay me back, I told myself it was fine. The second time, I asked gently and he laughed it off. By the third, I stopped asking. Not because it didn't matter, but because I already knew the answer. And somehow knowing made me quieter instead of firmer. It wasn't just money, it was time, attention, space. He would show up when he needed something and disappear when things were steady. I noticed it, but I never named it. Naming it would have required a boundary, and boundaries felt like rejection, so I stayed available. When Vanessa came into the picture, the pattern didn't change. It sharpened. She noticed things he never had. The way I organized bills, the way I planned months ahead, the way I saved instead of spent. At first it felt like interest, then it started to feel like inventory. I remember one afternoon clearly. We were sitting at the kitchen table and she asked how long it took me to build my savings. I answered without thinking. She nodded slowly, like she was doing math in her head. Ethan didn't say anything, he just watched her. That silence stayed with me. Sophie noticed it too in her own way. She would ask small questions after they left. Why does Uncle Ethan only come when he needs something? Why does Vanessa ask about money so much? I answered the same way every time I told her not to overthink. I told her family works differently. But the truth was, I was the one overthinking. Just in the wrong direction. I kept looking for reasons to trust instead of reasons to protect. There were other signs, subtle ones. Ethan lingering near my laptop longer than necessary. Vanessa glancing at my phone screen when it lit up. Questions that circled back to the same topics, accounts, work, future plans. Nothing direct enough to confront everything, just enough to ignore. And I did ignore it because acknowledging it would have meant accepting something I wasn't ready to accept. That the roles we grew up with had not changed. That I was still the one expected to give, and he was still the one who would take. The difference now was scale back, then it was small losses, a few $100s, a broken promise, a missed responsibility. Things that could be repaired or at least hidden. Over time, those small losses built a kind of tolerance in me. A quiet acceptance that this was just how things were between us. So when the larger loss came, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of permission. That's the part that unsettled me the most. Not just what he did, but how easy it had become. How natural it must have felt to sit in my home. Use my devices, move through my life. Like it belonged to him, because in a way I had let it. Not intentionally. Not consciously, but consistently, and consistency creates expectation. By the time I realized that the damage was already done. The moment everything changed did not come with raised voices or a final argument. It came in a quiet, ordinary space, sitting across from my daughter with her. Small hands resting on an old tablet I had forgotten even existed. She did not look scared. That was the first thing I noticed. She looked certain when she said she had handled it. I almost corrected her. I almost told her this was not something a child could fix. But then she turned the screen toward me and I understood she had not been trying to fix anything. She had been paying attention. The first file she opened was a video from our kitchen. The angle was slightly tilted like it had been placed in a hurry. Ethan stood near the counter. Vanessa leaned against the sink. Their voices were low, but clear enough. They were not guessing. They were planning. Not in vague terms, not in frustration, but in detail. Timelines, access points, what I left open, what I checked often, what I ignored. They spoke about my routines, the way someone studies a system they intend to use. I did not interrupt, I did not react, I just watched because something inside me had already gone still.